I have caught falling teacups, fainting dowagers, and one very determined goose that got loose in the east lawn during a garden fete 3 years running. 11 years in the royal guard of the palace at Harrowgate teaches you that your hands will be busy in ways no manual quite prepares you for. But nothing in those 11 years prepared me for the half-second when a stranger's fingers closed around the wrist of a 9-year-old princess and began, gently, almost lovingly, to lead her away from her own family in front of 400 witnesses. I want to tell you that story properly, which means I have to back up and tell you the whole day, because the woman who did it was not who anyone expected, and the reason she did it was not what anyone feared, and if I just gave you the ending, you would misunderstand everything that mattered about the middle. My name is Emeric Voss. I'm a corporal in the household guard, which in practical terms means I spend most of my working life standing very still in a red coat so that other people can feel safe enough to forget I am there. That is the job. Not the marching, not the ceremony, not the bearskin that makes tourists ask if I am hot in it. Yes, always, thank you for asking. The job is to be the reason nothing goes wrong on the one day someone decides to try something, and to be forgettable every other day so that the whole business does not feel like a fortress. The day I am telling you about was the Harrowgate Midsummer Fete, held every year on the east lawn of the palace grounds, and it is not what people picture when they hear royal event. There is no throne room, no red carpet, no orchestra. There are trestle tables and bunting, and a brass band that is enthusiastic rather than skilled, and for one afternoon a year the public is invited through the east gate to walk on grass that is usually theirs only from a distance. It raises money for the Rosalind Ward, the children's wing of Harrowgate General, named for the late Queen Mother, and it is, by design, the least guarded-feeling event on the royal calendar. That is precisely why it takes the most guarding. I was assigned to the inner perimeter that year, which meant I walked a loose, invisible circle around wherever the family happened to be standing, close enough to reach them in 3 strides, far enough that nobody at a lemonade stall thought twice about me. My partner for the detail was Corporal Petra Lang, a guardswoman I had served alongside for 4 years, sharp-eyed and unhurried in the way that the best of us learn to be, because panic is contagious and stillness is too. Above us both was Captain Ansel Bray, who ran the Fate's security from a folding table near the tea tent with 3 radios, and the permanently tired expression of a man who has done this 17 times and expects to do it 17 more. The royal family arrived a little after 10, on foot, through the low garden gate rather than the grand one, because King Alaric liked to remind people that this particular day was meant to feel like a village fair that had simply grown very large. Crown Prince Rowan came with Princess Alara, and between them, practically vibrating with the specific joy of a child who has been told she may eat as many sweets as she likes provided she does not tell her grandfather, was Princess Maelin. She was 9 that summer, all knees and questions, with a gap where a tooth had recently departed, and a habit of narrating her own adventures under her breath as if she were reporting them for posterity. Her older brother Torin, 11 and newly convinced that dignity required him to walk a little apart from the rest of the family, trailed behind with the studied boredom of a boy who was secretly thrilled to be there. Their youngest brother, Bram, had stayed home with a cold, which everyone that day would later agree, quietly and gratefully, was a mercy none of us had planned for. King Alaric moved through the crowd the way he always did at the fete, slowly, deliberately, stopping at every 3rd stall to buy something he did not need and did not want, because the stallholders had saved their best summer for this one afternoon, and he understood that his attention was the product being sold. I watched him shake 40 hands in the first 20 minutes. I watched Maelin watch him do it, learning without being taught, the way children learn everything that matters. I want to be honest about something before I go further, because it shapes everything that follows. I did not clock Agnes Caldwell in that first hour. I want to tell you I had some guardsman's instinct that flagged her the moment she came through the gate, because that would make a better story, but it would not be true, and this story does not need embellishing to be worth telling. What I did notice in that first hour was smaller and stranger, and I did not understand it until much later. There was a woman near the flower stall, mid-50s, neat gray coat despite the warmth of the day, a wicker basket over one arm, who was not buying flowers so much as arranging them. She would lift a bundle of Sweet William, turn it in the light, set it down, lift another. I remember thinking, in the unbothered way you think about 100 small things during a long shift, that she looked like someone killing time rather than someone shopping. I did not think anything else about her. There were 400 people on that lawn. You cannot flag them all, and if you try, you flag none of them properly. I am telling you this not to excuse what came later. Nothing needs excusing, because nothing went wrong that could not be fixed in the space of a breath, but because I think people imagine palace security as a wall of watchfulness that misses nothing. It is not that. It is a net woven loosely enough that ordinary people can walk through it without feeling caught, and tightly enough that the one thread that matters when it finally moves gets noticed in time. That is the whole art of the job. That was the day it was tested. By 11, the fete was in full noise. The band had found its rhythm, or at least its volume. A puppet stage had drawn a crowd of children near the old oak at the lawn's western edge, and the smell of griddled onions had begun to compete successfully with the roses. Maelin had been given, with her mother's blessing and my discreet nod, a modest freedom. She could move between the puppet stage, the lemonade stand, and the small enclosure where a retired regimental horse named Clover let children pet his nose, provided her governess, Mistress Corliss, or one of us kept her in sight at all times. That was the rule. It had worked at every fete for 6 years running. It was about to be tested in a way none of us had drilled for, because the threat we train for is a threat with intent, a blade, a grievance, a plan. Nobody drills for grief walking through the gate in a gray coat carrying a basket of flowers, because grief does not look like a threat until the moment it forgets, entirely and honestly, that it is one. I did not know any of that yet. I only knew it was a warm morning, the band was flat on the high notes, and a princess was laughing at a puppet fox somewhere near the old oak tree while I stood 20 feet away, watching everything and, as it turned out, not quite watching the one thing that would matter most. By noon the lawn had filled past what Captain Bray called, in his flat radio voice, comfortable density, which was his way of saying we were now managing a crowd rather than observing one. I had drifted with Maelin's orbit from the puppet stage to the horse enclosure, where Clover endured her enthusiastic patting with the weary patience of an animal who had met 1,000 children and forgiven every one of them. Mistress Corliss stood a few feet off, trading pleasantries with a woman from the Flower Guild, her eyes flicking back to Maelin every few seconds in the practiced rhythm of someone who has minded royal children long enough that vigilance has become as automatic as breathing. I saw the gray coat again near the hedge line, closer to the horse enclosure than the flower stall had been. I noted it the way you note a familiar face in a crowd without placing it, a flicker of asterisk haven't I seen you already that did not rise to the level of concern. She was watching the children at the fence, which was, on its face, the least remarkable thing a person could be doing at a petting enclosure. Half the adults on the lawn were doing the same. "You're doing the thing," Lang said, falling into step beside me with 2 paper cups of lemonade, handing me one without asking if I wanted it, which was correct because I did. "What thing?" "The thing where you catalog every stranger within 30 feet of her, like you're going to be quizzed on it later." "I am going to be quizzed on it later. It's called an after-action report." Lang smiled without quite looking convinced that was the whole answer, which it was not, though I would not have been able to tell her the rest of it that day. The truth is that I have always watched children in crowds more closely than the job strictly requires, and the reason for that sits far enough back in my own history that I rarely bring it out into daylight. But it belongs in this story, because it is, in its own roundabout way, the reason I was standing close enough to reach Maelin in 3 strides 11 years into this job, and not merely going through the motions of it. When I was 7, my younger sister Rin was 5, and our mother took us both to the autumn market in the town where we grew up, 3 streets from the harbor, nothing like a palace lawn but crowded in its own modest way. I let go of Rin's hand for the length of time it took to look at a stall of carved wooden birds. When I turned back, she was gone. Not far, 40 feet, as it turned out, drawn off by a puppeteer's bell the same way every child in earshot had been drawn. But for the 4 minutes it took to find her, I experienced a particular flavor of terror that does not fully leave a person. My mother did not shout at me. She held both of us very tightly on the walk home and said nothing at all, which somehow taught me more than shouting would have. I did not become a guardsman because of that afternoon. I became one because my father had been one, and because I was good at standing still and better at watching. But I would be lying if I told you that 4 minutes in a market 30 years ago had nothing to do with why. At any fete, any parade, any public event where a child of this family stood within reach of strangers, some part of me was always counting heads and measuring distances that were not, strictly, my job to measure. Lang did not know the story. She only knew the habit and had learned, kindly, not to tease it out of me too hard. "She's asking Clover if he wants to come to her birthday," Lang reported, nodding toward Maelin, who was indeed conducting what appeared to be a serious diplomatic negotiation with the horse. "He's declining," I said, diplomatically. "He's a horse of great tact." We were still smiling about that when Captain Bray's voice came low through the radio clipped at my collar. "Voss, Lang, converge on the tea tent. Rowan wants a word before the ribbon cutting." The ribbon cutting was the fete's centerpiece, the formal dedication of the new wing extension at Harrowgate General, funded in large part by the day's proceeds, which the king would open with a few remarks, and Rowan would follow with the actual ribbon. It required us to reposition the family briefly toward the small dais near the tea tent, 100 feet from the horse enclosure, which meant a controlled transition of exactly the kind we rehearsed and disliked in equal measure, because movement is when a net has the most gaps. "Corliss has her," Lang said, meaning Maelin, and it was true. The governess had already extended a hand and Maelin had taken it, still chattering about the horse, letting herself be steered toward the dais with the easy compliance of a child who trusted the adults around her completely. I gave the gray coat one more glance out of habit as we moved. She had drifted to the far side of the enclosure fence, still watching the children, and when a small boy nearby laughed at something Clover did with his ears, I saw her flinch. Not startle, flinch, the particular kind that comes from a sound landing somewhere it should not. I filed it. I did not chase it. There were 400 people and a princess in motion, and a flinch is not a crime. The dais stood in dappled shade beneath the fate's oldest oak, and by the time King Alaric climbed its 2 low steps, the crowd had thickened into a loose horseshoe 3 and 4 bodies deep. I took my position at the dais's left corner, Lang the right, with 2 more guardsmen, Corporal Willem Strayed, and a younger man named Fenwick, anchoring the family's flanks a little further back where the crowd pressed closest. Maelin stood with her mother, hand tucked into Alara's, watching her grandfather with the rapt attention children reserve for adults they are certain will eventually say something embarrassing. Alaric did not disappoint her. His remarks ran 4 minutes, most of them dry and self-deprecating. A joke about the size of the check he'd personally been talked into signing, a nod to the physicians of Harrowgate General who had, in his words, kept this family standing upright more times than I care to admit publicly. And when he finished, Rowan stepped up with the great ceremonial shears to cut a ribbon strung between 2 potted hedges that had clearly been placed there for exactly this photograph. It was, by any measure, a perfect, unremarkable, lovely 15 minutes. I remember the light coming green and gold through the oak leaves. I remember the band, mercifully paused for the speeches, striking up again the moment the ribbon fell, slightly too fast, slightly too loud, the way brass bands do when they've been waiting for their cue. I remember Maelin clapping with both hands over her head the way she did everything, entirely without restraint, and I remember thinking, with the particular contentment of a guard whose shift is going exactly according to plan, that this was going to be one of the easy ones. I want to be clear that nothing had gone wrong yet. Nothing was about to go wrong for some while yet. But I have learned, telling this story since, that people always want to know the moment the day turned, and if I am honest, the day did not turn all at once. It leaned slowly, the way a tide goes out before anyone notices the water is lower. And the leaning started, I think, in that hour after the ribbon cutting, when the crowd's attention scattered back out across the lawn, and the woman in the gray coat let it carry her, unhurried, back toward the puppet stage where the children had gathered again. By 1:30, the fete had reached what I privately thought of as its second wind, the ribbon cutting done, the lunch rush past, the afternoon settling into the loose, wandering rhythm of a crowd with nowhere urgent to be. Maelin had been allowed back to her small triangle of freedom, and I had resumed my slow orbit around its edges, Lang working the opposite arc so that between us, we never lost sight of her for more than a few seconds at a stretch. It was during this stretch that the fate produced its first real alarm of the day, and I want to tell you about it in full, because it matters to everything that came after, not because of what it was, but because of what it taught us about how quickly things can feel like they are going wrong even when they are not, and how that feeling changes what a guard pays attention to next. The puppet stage had built to its finale, a fox outwitting a wolf, to a chorus of children's delighted shrieking, and the crowd around it, 40 or 50 strong, surged forward at the punchline the way crowds do, packing tighter for a better view. I was 12 feet from Maelin when the surge happened. I was 8 feet from her half a second later, because the crowd's forward lean had folded around me the way water folds around a stone, and when I looked for her gray-blue dress in the press of bodies, I did not find it. I want to describe the next 90 seconds honestly, because they were not calm, and pretending otherwise would cheapen what came before and after them. I said her name into my collar radio in a voice I kept level through years of training and did not feel level at all. Lang's voice came back instantly, straight as eyes, hold, which told me someone had her before the words had finished registering in my chest, but 90 seconds of not knowing is not shortened by knowing the answer arrived quickly. It only feels short afterward. What had happened was almost embarrassingly simple. Torin, bored of standing near the adults, had wandered to the puppet stage himself, and Maelin, seeing her brother, had ducked through a gap in the crowd to stand beside him, 6 feet from where I'd last had her, invisible to me for the length of one shrieking, laughing crowd surge, perfectly safe the entire time. Strayed had picked her up in his sightline within seconds because that was his job and he was good at it. By the time I reached them, pushing more quickly through the crowd than I would ordinarily allow myself, both children were exactly where they should have been, laughing at a fox puppet, entirely unaware that for 90 seconds their world had briefly narrowed to the width of a radio channel. "She's fine," Lang said, arriving at my shoulder, reading my face rather than needing to ask. "Voss, she's fine." "I know. You don't look like you know." I did know. I could see her, 10 feet away, tugging her brother's sleeve to point out the fox's second costume change. But some part of the 7-year-old who had lost Ren for 4 minutes at a market 30 years gone had woken up fully during those 90 seconds, and it took me longer than it should have to put him back to sleep. Captain Bray met us at the enclosure fence a few minutes later, his radio still crackling with the tail end of the all-clear traffic, and I gave him the report the job required: crowd surge, momentary loss of visual, recovered within 90 seconds, no contact with any unknown party, subject unaware and unaffected. He nodded through it the way he nodded through every incident report, filing it in the flat, unbothered part of his mind reserved for things that had ended well. "Tighten the puppet stage perimeter for the rest of the day," he said. "And Voss, good radio discipline. You didn't panic on the channel, even though I'd bet good coin you were panicking everywhere else." "Copy that, sir." "That's the job," he said, not unkindly, and moved off toward the tea tent, where a different small crisis, a spilled urn, a stallholder in genuine distress about scones, had already claimed his attention, because a captain's day at a fete is one long relay of small fires, none of them large enough to stop the music. I noticed something else in the minutes after the puppet stage scare that I did not think much of at the time, and have thought about a great deal since. Torin, who had spent most of the morning maintaining the careful, deliberate distance of an 11-year-old determined not to be seen enjoying a children's fete, did not let go of his sister's hand again for the better part of 20 minutes. He did it without comment, without any of the fussing an adult might have made of it, simply keeping her fingers laced through his while the puppet show wound down and the crowd around them thinned, the way an older brother does a thing he would deny under questioning. "You all right?" I heard him ask her at one point, low, not meant for anyone else, and Maelin, who had not fully registered that anything alarming had happened at all, looked at him with the particular puzzlement of a child being asked about a fright she had not personally experienced. "I'm fine, why?" "No reason," Torin said, and released a breath I do not think he knew he'd been holding, and it occurred to me, watching it, that the 90 seconds which had cost me a decade off my composure had cost him something too, in his own quieter, more private register. The sudden, sharpening awareness that a sister he mostly regarded as an occasionally irritating fixture of his household was also, when the crowd folded around her, and she disappeared from view even briefly. Someone whose absence made his stomach drop the way mine had. Children learn that lesson at strange, unscheduled moments, usually without anyone meaning to teach it to them, and I remember thinking that whatever else that day held, it had already, by 1:30, given Torin something worth more than any of the Fate's stalls could have sold him. A clearer sense of exactly how much his sister mattered to him, delivered the hard way, the way most of the truly important lessons arrive. I mention it because it matters to what came later. When Alara gathered Maelin into her arms after Agnes Caldwell's hand opened, Torin was the second family member to reach them, arriving at a dead run from 30 feet off with a look on his face that had nothing studied or careful left in it at all. And it was Torin, not any adult, who put himself quietly at his sister's other side for the remainder of that evening, walking close enough that his shoulder brushed hers the whole way back to the east gate, saying almost nothing, needing to say nothing. Because some kinds of protection do not require words to be understood by the person receiving them. Here is the part I did not understand until much later, turning the whole day over afterward the way you turn over a stone to see what was underneath it the whole time. The 90-second scare at the puppet stage did something to all of us that was not on any incident report, because it is not the kind of thing that fits neatly into one. It gave the afternoon a shape in our minds. Here is where the risk lives. Here is what almost strong looks like. Watch the crowd surges. Watch the gaps. And having found a shape for the day's danger, some quiet, unconscious part of every guard on that lawn relaxed slightly around everything that did not match it. A crowd surge is loud and fast and looks like danger. A woman in a gray coat, standing quietly at the edge of a fence with a basket of flowers, moving slowly, speaking to no one, does not look like danger at all. It looks like nothing. That is precisely what made her safe to overlook, and precisely what would make her so hard to catch, an hour and a half later, until the very last second that mattered. I did not think about Agnes Caldwell again for the better part of an hour. I want to account for that hour honestly, because it was not idle. I checked Maelin's position perhaps 40 times in 60 minutes, by count, the habit as automatic as a pulse. But my conscious attention, the part of a guard's mind that actually forms judgments rather than just registering shapes, had moved on to other things. Chief among them was Fenwick, the youngest guardsman on our detail, who had grown visibly rattled by the puppet stage scare in a way that worried me more than the scare itself had. He was 23, 8 months out of training, and I had watched him during those 90 seconds go from alert to something closer to frozen, the particular stillness of a young guard whose body has not yet learned that the fastest way through fear is directly forward. Captain Bray had noticed too. Captains notice everything. That is the whole of what makes them captains, and had quietly rotated Fenwick to the outer gate detail, a lower stakes post, for the rest of the afternoon, a kindness dressed as a schedule change. "He'll be all right," Lang said when I mentioned it. "Everyone freezes once. The good ones only do it once." "I froze once too," I admitted. "First parade route. Man dropped a pigeon cage right in front of the procession, and I stood there like a fence post for a full second before I moved." "A pigeon cage." "It felt very dangerous at the time." She laughed, and the laugh did what conversation between partners on a long shift is supposed to do. It let the 90 seconds of real fear settle into something we could carry the rest of the day without it weighing on our hands. That is a skill too, as much as watching a crowd is. A guard who cannot set fear down between incidents becomes a liability by mid-afternoon, jumping at shadows, seeing threats in every stray glance. The job is to feel the fear fully and then fold it away, not to pretend it never came. It was somewhere in this stretch. I have gone back over the timeline enough times since, in enough formal debriefs, that I can place it fairly precisely at around 10 minutes to 3, that I saw the gray coat for the third time that day, and this time something in me did sit up, though not for the reason you would expect. She was sitting alone on a bench near the hedge maze that bordered the lawn's western edge, the wicker basket beside her, untouched, the flowers inside it beginning to wilt in the afternoon heat. She was not watching the children now. She was looking at her own hands, turning something over in them, small enough that I could not make it out from 30 feet, though I would learn later it was a hair ribbon, pale yellow, worn soft with age and handling. And she was crying, quietly, the unshowy kind of crying that people do when they believe no one is looking and have stopped trying to stop it. I did not read menace into that. I want to be honest about what I actually thought, standing there, because it would be easy now, knowing everything I know, to claim some sharper instinct than I actually had. What I thought was, that woman is having a very hard day, and it has nothing to do with us. Grief on a lawn full of strangers celebrating a children's hospital wing is not unusual. The fate drew people whose own children had passed through those very wards, some healed, some not, and the day carried an undertow of that for anyone paying attention. I nearly walked past it entirely. But something made me mention it to Lang when our loop brought us within earshot of each other again, more out of the ordinary decency you extend to a stranger having a bad afternoon than out of any professional concern. "Woman on the bench by the maze," I said. "Might want someone from the welfare tent to check on her. Looks like she's had a rough one." "I'll flag it to the medical volunteers," Lang said, and did, radioing it through as a welfare check rather than a security matter, which was the correct call with the information either of us had. A woman crying alone on a bench is a kindness to notice, and a welfare volunteer's job to tend to. It was not, by any reasonable standard I could have applied in that moment, a security matter at all. I tell you this part in such detail because I think it is the honest heart of how these things actually happen, far more than any story about a guard's instinct catching a villain the second he walks through the gate. Agnes Caldwell was not hiding. She was not stalking. She was a grieving woman sitting in plain view, crying over a hair ribbon, and the entire apparatus of royal security walked past her 3 times that day, and correctly, reasonably, saw nothing but a stranger's private sorrow that deserved gentleness rather than suspicion. The welfare volunteer, a kind, harried young woman named Poppy who staffed the first aid tent, found the bench empty when she went to check 10 minutes later. Agnes had moved on. Nobody thought much of it. People at a fete move on constantly. That is the nature of a fete. I did not know, standing in the dappled afternoon light with the band playing something almost recognizable as a waltz, that the day's true turning point had already happened, quietly, on a bench by a hedge maze, in the space between a woman's tears and a stranger's kindness that arrived a decade too late and a decade after the person it might have saved had already been gone. I only knew that it was 3 o'clock. The light had gone gold in the way it does in late afternoon, and somewhere near the lemonade stand, Princess Maelin was asking Mistress Corliss whether she might have one more cup before they went home. Between the bench and the last hour, there was a stretch of nearly 90 minutes that I would later spend more time reconstructing, in my own head and in 3 separate written reports, than almost any other part of that day, because it was the stretch in which the fate handed us a threat that looked exactly like a threat is supposed to look, and let us believe, with real relief, that we had already met the day's test and passed it. It started at the hedge maze, not 20 minutes after Poppy found Agnes Caldwell's bench empty. Strade's voice came over the radio, tight and controlled in the particular way that meant something real rather than routine. "Voss, Lang, I've got a subject on the east side of the maze with a long lens, shooting through the hedge gaps. He's not credentialed." Declining to lower the camera. I want to explain why that sentence, on its own, carries more weight in our world than almost anything else short of a raised hand. The fete was open to the public, and photography was welcomed, encouraged, even since half the point of the day was goodwill, and goodwill photographs well. But credentialed press wore a lanyard and worked from a roped enclosure near the dais, briefed that morning on exactly what was and was not permitted. A man with a long lens working the gaps in a hedge maze, close enough to catch faces without anyone posing for him, was not covering a charity fete. He was hunting for something, and men who hunt for something with a camera around a 9-year-old are a category of risk we take exactly as seriously as any other. Lang and I reached the maze inside 40 seconds, moving fast enough to draw glances but not so fast as to alarm the thinning crowd, which is its own particular skill. The hurried but unhurried walk every guard learns in the first year and never quite stops practicing. Strade had already closed to within 10 feet of the man, a heavy-set figure in a beige jacket with a camera bag slung crosswise, and had positioned himself with the loose, non-confrontational stance we're trained to hold in situations that have not yet become physical, and with any luck, never will. "Sir, I need to see some identification," Strade was saying, in the same level voice I would use myself an hour later on a very different lawn with a very different stranger. "This area's open to the public, but photography of the family requires press credentials, and you don't appear to be wearing any." "I'm freelance," the man said, not lowering the camera, angling instead for one more frame through a gap in the hedge where I registered with a cold drop in my stomach. Maelin and her new friend from the horse enclosure had reappeared, laughing over something near the maze's outer wall, 40 feet away and entirely unaware they were in anyone's viewfinder. "I don't need a badge to stand on a public lawn." "You don't," I agreed, arriving at Strade's shoulder, keeping my own voice as level as his. "But you do need one to photograph a minor member of the royal family at this event, and you don't have one, so I'm going to need you to lower the camera and come with me to the gate." What followed was not dramatic in the way people imagine these things. No shouting, no chase, no hand laid on anyone who did not first lay a hand on us. It was 4 minutes of a man testing exactly how far his indignation could get him, insisting he had every right, invoking the word, public, 9 or 10 times as though repetition might change what it meant, while 3 guardsmen formed an unhurried, immovable wall between his lens and the 2 children beyond the hedge, and Lang quietly radioed the gate to have the local constabulary liaison meet us there. He surrendered the camera's memory card without much more resistance, once it became clear that resistance bought him nothing but a longer walk to the gate in front of a great many people watching, and Sergeant Dunmore of the town watch, who staffed the East Gate every fete out of long habit and longer friendship with Captain Bray, took his details, confiscated the card pending review, and sent him on his way with a formal caution and the particular flat unfriendliness reserved for men who make guardsmen's afternoons longer than they need to be. "That's our excitement for the day, I'd wager," Bray said afterward, meeting us near the tea tent as the little knot of tension dissolved back into the ordinary hum of a fete winding toward evening. He said it lightly, the way captains say things they only half mean, testing the words against the day to see if they held. Tabloid stringer chancing his arm for a picture he can sell for the price of a used car will get a stern letter to whatever rag he's freelancing for, and that'll be the end of it. I remember agreeing with him. I remember, more specifically, feeling the particular loosening in my shoulders that comes when a shift's one real incident has arrived, been handled and closed, the sense, entirely human and entirely wrong, that the day's danger had introduced itself, been shown the gate, and would not be coming back. Lang felt it too. I watched her exhale in a way she hadn't all afternoon. Even Fenwick, still smarting from the puppet stage freeze, allowed himself a small, relieved grin when the story of the photographer reached him at the outer gate, as though the day's ledger had been squared and he could stop waiting for the other shoe. That is the exact shape of the mistake, if you can even call it a mistake, because nobody did anything wrong. A credible threat appeared, in a form every guard's training tells them to expect: a man, a camera, a refusal to comply, a plausible motive. We handled it correctly, quickly, and without incident. And having handled it, every one of us, from Bray down to the newest guardsman at the gate, allowed some small, unspoken part of our vigilance to stand down, because the human mind is not built to sustain maximum alertness for 6 straight hours without occasionally deciding, on some evidence or none, that the worst has already come and gone. It had not. While Strayed walked the photographer to the gate and Lang briefed Bray, I did one more slow circuit of the lawn, the kind of loop a guard does less because anything demands it, and more because standing still after an incident feels wrong in the body, even when the mind has decided the danger has passed. That loop took me past the tea tent, where I saw Agnes Caldwell again, for the 4th time that day, though I did not yet know to count her that way. She was sitting at one of the long trestle tables, a slice of seed cake in front of her, untouched, and Poppy, the same welfare volunteer who had found her bench empty 20 minutes earlier, had found her again and settled across from her with the easy, unhurried kindness that made Poppy good at her job. I was not close enough to hear all of it, and I would not have listened closely even if I had been, because a stranger's grief is not security business unless it becomes one. But I caught the shape of it as I passed, Poppy's hand resting briefly on the table near Agnes's, not quite touching, Agnes shaking her head, managing something that might have been a smile, Poppy offering a folded paper napkin, which Agnes accepted and pressed briefly to the corner of one eye. "You're sure you're all right?" I heard Poppy ask as I drew level with the table, and I have turned the moment over many times since, wondering whether I should have stopped, should have asked something myself, should have done anything at all beyond noting it and walking on. I do not believe, even now, having relived that day from every angle a formal debrief can demand, that stopping would have changed anything. Agnes Caldwell was not behaving like a woman in the grip of a plan. She was behaving like a woman in the grip of a grief so large it had temporarily crowded out everything else, including, I would come to understand, her own clear sense of where and when she was. "Just a hard day," she said, and her voice was warm, apologetic, entirely lucid in the way that grief so often is right up until it isn't. "Thank you for asking. I'm all right. I think I'll just sit a while longer if that's all right, and then I'll head home." Poppy patted her hand once, satisfied by an answer that gave her no grounds to press further, and moved on to check the lemonade stand's dwindling ice supply, because a fate does not stop needing tending just because one stranger is having a difficult afternoon. I moved on too, my loop carrying me back toward the horse enclosure, where Clover was being led toward his trailer for the evening, and Maelin was saying an elaborate, ceremonial goodbye that involved, as far as I could tell, a promise of carrots at some unspecified future date. I want to be honest that nothing about that exchange at the tea tent alarmed me in the moment. It would only take on its full weight afterward, reconstructed alongside everything else, when a kind, ordinary conversation between a volunteer and a grieving stranger would be read back, in hindsight, as the last soft place where the day might have turned differently and did not through anyone's failure, but simply because grief, unlike a camera or a raised hand, does not announce itself as a hazard, and the systems built to catch hazards are not built, and perhaps cannot be built to catch it in time every single time. I found out much later, weeks later in fact, from a case file I was permitted to read as part of the formal review, and again from Agnes Caldwell herself, in a conversation I will get to, that she had told Poppy the truth in every particular except the one that mattered. It had in fact been a hard day. She had in fact meant to go home. What she had not said, because I do not believe she yet knew it about herself in any way she could have put into words at a trestle table to a stranger with a napkin, was that some private clock inside her, wound tighter with every child's laugh drifting across that lawn, was counting down toward a moment she would not see coming until she was already standing inside it. By 3:30, the crowd had thinned enough that Captain Bray made the call to begin what he termed, without any particular ceremony, the long goodbye, the gradual 30-minute process of walking the royal family back toward the east gate at a pace slow enough to look unhurried and fast enough to have them through it before the Fate's remaining stallholders finished packing their bunting. King Alaric, however, was not yet ready to be walked anywhere. I watched him detour, on the way toward the gate, to a small knot of people near the tea tent that included a woman in a wheelchair and a boy of perhaps 10, with the particular pale, careful stillness of a child recently out of hospital. The boy's mother, when Alaric stopped to speak with them, went quite red in the face and could not, for a moment, manage a full sentence, and Alaric, who had clearly done this exact kind of thing more times than anyone could count, and had never once let it become routine, crouched down to the boy's eye level and asked him, with real interest, whether the Rosalind Ward's New Games room had a decent selection, or whether the king ought to have a word with someone about it. "They've got drafts," the boy said solemnly, "but no proper chess." "That," Alaric said with equal solemnity, "is an oversight I intend to correct personally," and the boy's mother laughed despite herself, and the boy grinned the wide, unguarded grin of a child who has just been taken entirely seriously by someone very important, and I thought, watching it, that this, a king crouching in the grass to discuss board games with a sick child, while his own bearskin-hatted guards ringed the moment at a respectful distance, was as close as the job ever let me get to understanding why any of it mattered, not the ceremony, this. My radio was quiet during that stretch, which for a guard is its own small luxury, and I used the lull the way most of us do, which is to say, I let my mind wander somewhere it does not often get to go on duty. My sister Wren had sent word that morning, through the ordinary channel of a note left with the gate porter, since guardsmen on protective detail are not permitted phones on their person, that she and her husband wanted the family together for Sunday lunch, because she had news she would rather deliver at a table than down a telephone line. I did not need her to spell it out. Wren was 32, married 4 years, and had been dropping small, deliberate hints about nurseries and names for the better part of a year, and I had spent most of that morning slow patches doing the arithmetic of an uncle-to-be, working out which room in her cottage got the better light, and whether I still remembered how to hold something that small without breaking it. It is a strange thing, being handed news like that on a day already built entirely around the safety of somebody else's children. I remember thinking, watching Maelin lean her head briefly against her father's arm while he laughed at something the physician had said, that there was a straight, unbroken line running from a market stall 30 years ago, past a wooden cot Wren and her husband had not yet bought, all the way to a princess in a gray-blue dress asking a horse to attend her birthday. All of it was the same thing. Really, the whole apparatus of a family, of a kingdom, of a fate on a summer lawn, built around the plain, stubborn insistence that children ought to be kept safe long enough to grow up and hand the world onward. I did not know, standing there working out nursery light, that I was about to be tested on exactly that insistence within the hour, nor that the woman who would test it had, 3 years earlier, watched a different child's cot go permanently, unbearably empty. Rowan and Alara, a little further off, were having their own version of the same conversation with a different family, and Maelin had drifted to stand near her father's leg, tired now in the specific, glassy-eyed way of a child who has had an enormous, wonderful day and is beginning, without quite admitting it, to want her own bed. Torin had reclaimed some of his dignity and was walking a few respectful steps behind the family group, though I noticed he had, at some point in the last hour, quietly taken his sister's lemonade cup to carry for her, a small unasked kindness he would have died before admitting to. "Nearly there," Lang said, falling in beside me as we shadowed the family's slow drift toward the gate. "Bray wants us through the east perimeter by 4:30. Give the horses time to get the last carriage loaded before the light goes." "She's flagging," I said, nodding at Maelin. "They always flag around now. It's the sugar. Give it 20 minutes, and she'll be asleep on her father's shoulder before they're through the gate." I laughed because it was true, and because Lang had a way of saying true things that made a long day feel shorter. I did not know, saying it, that we did not have 20 minutes. I did not know that somewhere behind us, past the tea tent, past the trestle tables where a slice of untouched seed cake had gone soft in the afternoon warmth, a woman in a gray coat had risen from her seat, left her basket on the bench, and begun, with the calm, unhurried certainty of someone who believes she is simply going to collect her own child from a school gate, to walk toward the face-painting table where Princess Maelin had asked, one final time before her family led her home, whether she might have a butterfly on her cheek to show her grandfather. Captain Bray called this last stretch the soft hour, and it was, by his own long experience, the part of the day when guards most needed to resist the temptation to relax, because a thinning crowd feels safer than it is. Fewer people does not mean fewer risks. It sometimes means the opposite, because the ones who remain are the ones who came for a reason, and by 4 o'clock the innocent reasons had mostly gone home. Maelin, granted her extra cup of lemonade before the walk to the gate, had drifted with Corliss back past the puppet stage, now dismantled, its performers packing painted plywood foxes into a cart, and from there toward a smaller attraction that had opened only in the fate's final hour, a face-painting table run by 2 young women from the town, doing butterflies and lions, and by special request, a passable heraldic lion in the house of Harrowgate's colors for any child bold enough to ask. I had drifted with her, 30 feet back, Lang covering the opposite flank near the tea tent, where King Alaric had settled into a folding chair with the specific, deep satisfaction of a monarch who has successfully raised a great deal of money, and can now, briefly, do nothing at all. Rowan and Alara stood nearby in quiet conversation with the hospital's chief physician, the kind of unhurried, genuine exchange that only happens once the day's performances are over, and the real people underneath them are allowed to reappear. It was in this loosened, late afternoon calm, the exact conditions Captain Bray warned against every single briefing, that I saw the gray coat one final time, and this time it was close. Close enough that I registered, before I registered anything else, that she had changed. The wicker basket was gone. The composed, distracted wandering was gone. She was moving with purpose now, a direct line across the grass toward the face-painting table, toward the small queue of children waiting their turn, toward the space where Maelin stood third in line, swinging her lemonade cup by its handle and chattering to a boy she'd apparently made friends with an hour earlier over Clover's diplomatic refusals. I want to walk through exactly what I saw and exactly what I felt in order, because the whole of what happened next took perhaps 11 seconds from the moment I registered the change in her walk to the moment my hand closed, and 11 seconds is not very long to make every decision that mattered. First, the pace. She was not strolling. She had covered perhaps 40 feet in the time it takes to notice someone is walking with purpose, which is not very long at all, and every stride was aimed, not wandering. Second, her face. I could see it now, and it was wrong in a way I did not have a word for yet, not angry, not furtive, not the guarded, scanning look of someone trying not to be seen. It was soft, open, lit with something that looked from 30 feet disturbingly like joy, the particular unguarded joy of a person who believes, in that instant, that the worst thing that ever happened to them has just, impossibly, been undone. Third, and this is the detail that moved my feet before my mind had finished the sentence, she was saying a name. Not loudly, not urgently. In the soft, private voice a mother uses across a crowded room when she is certain her child will hear it above everything else, because a mother's voice always carries to her child no matter the noise. The name was not Maelin. "Nell," she said. "Nell, sweetheart, there you are." I was already moving. I do not remember consciously deciding to move. I remember the grass under my boots and Lang's voice somewhere behind me asking what she was seeing on my face, because apparently my face had already told her something was wrong before my mouth had. I closed the distance in perhaps 4 strides, which felt like considerably more, and I was still 6 feet away when Agnes Caldwell reached the front of the small queue, crouched slightly to bring herself level with a 9-year-old girl she had never met, and closed her hand gently around Maelin's wrist. "There you are," she said again, and her voice cracked on the second word, wet with a relief so complete it had nowhere else to go but her eyes. "We have to go home now, love. It's getting late. Your father will worry." Maelin's first reaction was not fear. I want to be precise about this, because it matters enormously to everything that followed. She was startled. Anyone would be. A stranger's hand closing around your wrist without warning, and she looked up with the particular wide-eyed confusion of a child encountering an adult behaving in a way that does not match any adult behavior she has a category for. But there was no violence in the grip, no urgency in the pull, nothing in the moment that read, even to Maelin in that first half-second, as an attack. It read as strange. It read as a stranger who had made a mistake and did not yet know it. "I'm not," Maelin started to say, and I believe, turning it over since, that she was about to say "I'm not Nell. I'm Maelin asterisk," the plain, patient correction any child offers when an adult has confused them with someone else, before I was there. I did not grab Agnes Caldwell. I want that understood clearly and for good reason, because what I did in the next 2 seconds shaped everything that happened for the rest of that day, and I would come to believe, for the rest of Agnes Caldwell's recovery. I stepped between them, not violently, not with the sharp shove of a takedown, but with the same firm, unhurried authority I used to redirect a crowd at a rope line, and I set my own hand open over the hand that held Maelin's wrist, not pulling, simply covering, the way you'd steady a glass about to tip rather than snatch it away. "Let's give her a bit of room," I said, in the low, even voice we are trained to use for exactly this, not a command, not a threat, a suggestion offered with enough calm that the body hearing it has no reason to fight it. "You've got the wrong girl, ma'am. Let's just step back a moment." For one long second, Agnes Caldwell did not move at all. Her hand stayed closed around Maelin's wrist, her eyes fixed on the child's face with an intensity that had nothing sinister in it and everything desperate, the look of someone standing at the exact center of a miracle they know, somewhere beneath the wanting, cannot possibly be real. I have thought about that second more than almost any other moment in 11 years of service, because it was not a standoff. It was a woman's whole grief, arriving at the edge of a cliff it had been walking toward all day. And for 1 second, she simply could not make herself step back from the only thing that had felt like her daughter in 3 years. Then her hand opened. Maelin's wrist slipped free, and I moved the child gently but immediately behind me with my other arm, a single motion, the whole of it taking perhaps a second and a half, and by the time Lang arrived at my shoulder, she had covered the distance nearly as fast as I had, radio already up, calling the code that brought Strayed and 2 more guardsmen converging from opposite corners of the lawn. Maelin was safely a full arm's length behind me, wide-eyed, startled. One hand pressed to the wrist that had been held, but entirely, completely unhurt. "I'm sorry," Agnes Caldwell said, into the sudden silence of a face-painting queue that had gone very quiet very fast, and her voice had already changed, the joy draining out of it as understanding began, visibly, to arrive. "Oh, I'm so sorry," I thought. She did not finish the sentence. She did not need to. I had already seen enough of her face to know exactly what she had thought, and exactly how completely, catastrophically wrong it had been, and exactly how little malice had traveled anywhere near the 11 seconds that had just passed. Behind me, I heard Ilara's voice, sharp with the particular fear that belongs only to mothers, cutting across the lawn, "Maelin." And the fast, light footsteps of a queen consort-in-waiting who had crossed 40 feet of grass faster than any of the guardsmen converging from the same distance. I want to pause the story right here, at this exact second, because everything that came before it was the slow leaning of a tide going out, and everything that came after it happened very fast, and I think it matters to sit for one moment in the space between them. The space where a princess stood safely behind a guard's arm, unhurt, startled but not harmed, and a grieving stranger stood in front of him with her empty hand still half raised, already beginning, in a voice thick with dawning horror at her own mistake, to apologize to a child she had never meant to frighten, and a family she had never meant to touch. Because that is the story, not a kidnapping. A woman's grief, walking for 11 seconds, straight into the middle of someone else's ordinary Tuesday, before 11 years of training closed a hand over hers, and gently, without a single raised voice, brought her back. What happened in the minutes after that is, I think, the part of the story that actually matters most, because it is the part that tells you what kind of household this is, and what kind of family I have spent my career protecting, and it did not go the way a stranger watching from a distance might have expected. Ilara reached Maelin before I had fully straightened, dropping to her knees in the grass in a way no lady-in-waiting would ever have advised for a formal gown, and doing it anyway, gathering her daughter into her arms with the fierce, wordless thoroughness of a mother checking, hand over hand, that every part of a child is exactly where it should be. Maelin, for her part, was not sobbing. I want to be exact about this, because it is the whole point of telling the story at all. She was startled, her breath came quick, her small hand still cradled the wrist that had been held, and she pressed hard into her mother's shoulder for a moment the way any child does after a fright. But there were no tears yet, and when they came, a minute or so later, they came the ordinary way a child cries after a jolt to the nerves rather than after real harm, the kind that empties out fast once someone trustworthy is holding you. "I'm all right," she said, muffled into Ilara's shoulder, and then, lifting her head with the particular resilience children carry that adults spend a lifetime trying to relearn, she called me Nell. Why did she call me Nell? It was, of everything said in that first minute, the question that told me most about what kind of child Maelin was, and it has stayed with me since. Not is she going to hurt me, that fear had already come and gone in the space of a heartbeat, replaced almost instantly by something closer to bewilderment. A 9-year-old, freshly frightened, wanted to know why a stranger had gotten her name wrong. It is the kind of question only a child who has never yet been taught to expect cruelty from the world can ask, and I would spend a good part of that evening hoping, fiercely, that this single afternoon did not teach it to her. Rowan reached us a half-second behind his wife, and where Alara's instinct had been to gather, his was to place himself. A broad, immediate step that put his own shoulder between his daughter and the rest of the lawn, not toward Agnes Caldwell with any anger in it, but simply the old, unthinking geometry of a father making his body into a wall. I watched him take one look at Maelin's face, register that she was frightened but not hurt, and only then let his attention move to the woman still standing 3 feet away with her empty hand half raised, and her face collapsing, in real time, under the weight of what she had just done. "She's fine," I said to him quickly, because that was the first and only fact that mattered, and I wanted him to have it before anything else crowded in. Untouched, startled, nothing more, I had her clear before contact went past a hand on the wrist. Rowan nodded once, the sharp, economical nod of a man filing that fact away so he could function, and turned his full attention to his daughter, crouching to her level the way his father had crouched for the boy with no proper chess, said an hour before, murmuring something too low for me to hear that made Maelin's shoulders come down a fraction from where fright had pulled them up around her ears. King Alaric arrived a few seconds later, having crossed the lawn at a pace that startled 2 of his own protection officers, and I watched him take in the whole scene with the swift, practiced assessment of a man who had, in 70 years, learned to separate the actually dangerous from the merely alarming faster than almost anyone I have ever served. His eyes went first to Maelin, found her upright, breathing, held, and only then to Agnes Caldwell, and what crossed his face in that second surprised me, because it was not the cold fury I half expected from a grandfather whose granddaughter had just been taken by the wrist by a stranger. It was something closer to a frown of concentration, the look of a man doing arithmetic on a woman's face, and not liking the answer he was arriving at. "Corporal," he said to me quietly before anyone else had spoken, "is my granddaughter hurt?" "No, Your Majesty," startled, "nothing more." "Good." He held my eyes a beat longer than the answer strictly required, the way he does when he wants a man to know he has been heard and believed without needing it repeated, and then his gaze went back to Agnes Caldwell, who had not moved, had not run, had not so much as looked away from Maelin since her hand had opened, and who was now, I realized, shaking. Not with defiance, but with the particular full-body tremor of a person coming up out of deep water and finding the air colder than she remembered. By then Lang and Strayed had closed the last of the distance, and the training that governs exactly this moment took over with the same unhurried thoroughness it had shown all day. Nobody shouted. Nobody drew a weapon that had no earthly reason to be drawn against an unarmed, weeping woman who had already released the child and shown no resistance whatsoever. Strayed positioned himself at Agnes Caldwell's other side, not touching her, simply present, the way you stand near someone at the edge of a step you are not sure they will manage on their own. "Ma'am, I need you to stay right where you are for a moment," Lang said, in the same trained, level register I had used a minute earlier, because the whole art of this part of the job is never letting the voice change once it has found the right note. "You're not in any trouble for standing still. Just stay with us." "I know her," Agnes Caldwell said, and it was not defiance either. It came out cracked and small, the voice of someone still half inside a dream arguing with the daylight that has begun cruelly to dismantle it. I know her. I was so sure." She stopped. Her eyes moved for the first time, away from Maelin and toward her own empty hand, as though the hand itself might explain what had just happened to her, and whatever she found there broke something loose, because the next sound she made was not words at all. It was the low, involuntary sound of a person's whole body understanding, before her mind had fully caught up, exactly what she had just done and exactly why it had felt, for one unbearable, beautiful minute, like the answer to 3 years of praying for something that could not be prayed back. I did not put her in restraints. I want to explain why, because it was a decision, not an oversight, and because I believe it was the correct one and would make it again without hesitation. The protocol we train under gives a guard real discretion in exactly this kind of moment. An unarmed individual, no ongoing threat, full compliance, visible and severe emotional distress, and every signal in front of me was screaming the same message. This was not a woman calculating an escape. This was a woman who had just watched the floor of her own reality give way beneath her in front of 400 strangers and a royal family. And cuffing her wrists at that moment would have answered nothing about safety, and everything about how little mercy this household was prepared to show a person in the worst minute of her life. "You're going to come with us," I said instead, keeping my hand light at her elbow, the way you'd guide someone unsteady on their feet rather than someone you distrusted. "Nobody's going to hurt you. We just need to get you somewhere quieter and have someone look after you." She let me lead her, unresisting, the 10 steps to the shade at the edge of the maze hedge, away from the queue of children still standing frozen at the face-painting table, away from the crowd that had begun, inevitably, to gather at the edges of what it correctly sensed had just been a very close thing. Fenwick, redeeming in one motion whatever he believed the puppet stage had cost him earlier that day, moved to the crowd's edge without needing to be told and began, calmly and firmly, to widen the gap between the onlookers and the small group under the hedge. Not shouting, not shoving, simply a broad-shouldered presence repeating, evenly, that there was nothing more to see and the Fate cider stall still had a queue worth joining. I saw at least 2 phones come up in the first 10 seconds, the reflexive modern instinct to record first and understand later, and I saw Strayed step, without breaking stride, directly into the sightline of the nearest one, not confiscating it, not making a scene of it, simply standing where the shot could not be had. Whatever else that afternoon became in the retelling, it was not going to become a video of a broken woman's worst minute circulating by supper time, not while any of us were standing between her and a lens. Behind us, I heard Alara's voice again, softer now, no longer sharp with fear but murmuring something into Maelin's hair, and I heard, distinctly, Maelin's small voice ask a second question that I have thought about nearly as often as her first. "Is the lady going to be all right?" Nobody answered her immediately because none of us yet knew, and I think that not knowing is worth sitting inside for a moment, because it is the truest thing about that entire afternoon. We had caught the danger in time. We had not yet caught the reason for it. The physician Rowan and Alara had been speaking with minutes earlier. Dr. Halloway, the chief of medicine at Harrowgate General, present at the fete precisely because his hospital's new wing had just been dedicated in his name's honor that very morning, reached us within a minute of being summoned, his manner shifting instantly and completely from the easy warmth of small talk into the crisp, unhurried focus of a doctor arriving at a scene. He knelt in front of Agnes Caldwell rather than looming over her, took her pulse without asking permission first because her hands were shaking too hard to have refused sensibly, and asked her, gently, whether she had eaten anything that day, whether she was taking any medication, whether she knew what day it was and where she was standing. She answered all of it, haltingly, correctly. That mattered enormously, because it told Dr. Halloway within 90 seconds what I had already begun to suspect, and what the formal assessment would confirm over the following hour, that this was not intoxication, not a seizure, not any of the medical causes that can make a person briefly lose their grip on who is in front of them. Her mind was entirely clear about everything except the one unbearable thing it had, for a handful of minutes, refused to accept. "What's your name?" Dr. Halloway asked, still kneeling, still gentle, and I watched her face crumple properly for the first time, the composure that had carried her through the last 5 minutes finally giving way entirely. "Agnes," she said. "Agnes Caldwell." And then, because the question had opened a door she could no longer keep shut, in a voice scraped raw with 3 years of trying not to say it out loud in front of anyone, "My daughter's name was Nell. She would have been 9 today." I want to tell you what those words did to everyone standing close enough to hear them, because it was not what you might expect from a family whose child had just been frightened by this same woman's hands. King Alaric, who had remained a few feet off, close enough to be near his granddaughter and far enough to let his guards do their work without a monarch's shadow over it, went very still. I saw something move across his face that I recognized, because I had seen its cousin on my own mother's face once, 30 years ago, in the 4 minutes it took to find Wren at a market. The particular, complete understanding that arrives in a person who has ever stood near the edge of losing a child themselves, even if the ground held. Would have been, he repeated, quietly, not a question, simply the sound of the words landing. Agnes Caldwell nodded, once, and then the tears that had been threatening since her hand opened around Maelin's wrist finally came in full, and Dr. Halloway, without any instruction needed, moved to sit beside her rather than in front of her, and put a steadying hand on her shoulder in the unhurried, practiced way of a man who had delivered a great many hard truths to a great many frightened people, and had learned, over decades, that the kindest thing you can do in the first minute of someone's collapse is simply not let them fall alone. Sergeant Dunmore arrived from the East Gate a few minutes later, summoned as procedure required for any incident involving physical contact with a member of the royal family, however brief and however plainly unintentional it had turned out to be. He is a decent, unhurried man, Dunmore, 20 years on the town watch, and I watched him take in the scene, a weeping woman being steadied by a physician, a princess safely wrapped in her mother's arms 30 feet away, a king standing with his hands folded, and his jaw set in an expression I had never quite seen on him before, and make, within seconds, exactly the judgment the moment required. "I'll need her name and particulars for the record," he said to me, quietly, off to one side, "and there'll have to be a formal statement, given what happened. But, Corporal, I'm not clapping a woman in irons for grief. Whatever comes of this, it wants a doctor a good deal more than it wants a cell." "Agreed," I said, and meant it entirely, and it did not surprise me in the least, a moment later, to hear King Alaric say something very close to the same thing, directly to Dunmore, in the quiet, unequivocal voice he reserved for the handful of matters he considered beyond negotiation. "This woman is not to be treated as a criminal in my presence or out of it," he said. "She is to be treated as someone who needs help, and she is to have it today, properly, and not as an afterthought once the paperwork is finished. Is that understood?" "Understood, Your Majesty," Dunmore said, and I do not believe I imagined the faint, surprised respect in his voice, because it is not every day a town sergeant hears a king give that particular order in that particular tone about a stranger who had, 10 minutes earlier, taken hold of his own granddaughter. It took the better part of an hour, there in the shade of the hedge maze, with the fate packing down around us in the ordinary, oblivious way that a large event does even while something extraordinary has just happened 40 feet from the lemonade stand, to piece together the full shape of what had brought Agnes Caldwell to that face-painting cue. Some of it came from her, in halting fragments, as Dr. Halloway's steady presence and a cup of sweet, strong tea someone had produced from the tea tent slowly talked her nervous system back down out of the place it had gone. More of it came over the following days, from a grief counselor named Mrs. Aldous who was called in that same evening at Dr. Halloway's recommendation, and from Agnes's neighbor, a kind, worried woman named Mrs. Prout who arrived at the palace gate that night asking, in genuine distress, whether anyone had seen Agnes, because she had gone to the fete that morning at Mrs. Prout's own gentle urging and had not come home. I happened to be on gate duty myself that evening when Mrs. Prout arrived, still in her gardening apron, having walked the 1.5 miles from her cottage without stopping to change, because she had convinced herself, on the walk over, that something terrible had happened, and that every minute spent tidying herself up was a minute Agnes might be in danger. She was in a state herself by the time she reached me, wringing a handkerchief between both hands, and I remember the particular guilt in her voice when she explained why she'd sent Agnes to the fete at all. "I only wanted her out of that house for an afternoon," she told me twice, as though repetition might undo what had happened. "She's been shutting the curtains earlier every week. I thought fresh air and a bit of noise would do her good. I never imagined." "You couldn't have," I told her and meant it, because there was no version of that morning's ordinary, well-meant kindness that could have predicted where the afternoon would end, and I did not want a good woman carrying guilt that belonged to grief and to nobody's decision at all. "She's safe. She's being looked after properly, by people who know what they're doing. You did right by her, getting her out of that house. The day just asked more of her than either of you could have known to expect." It seemed to steady her, a little, though I do not think it fully lifted until she was allowed, the following morning, to see Agnes herself at the clinic and confirm with her own eyes that her neighbor was safe, cared for, and as much as anyone can be, one day removed from a fracture like that, beginning slowly to come back together. Mrs. Prout visited her every week afterward, by all later accounts, without fail, through the whole of Agnes's recovery, and I have thought since that the kindness which had accidentally set that afternoon in motion was the very same kindness that carried Agnes steadily out the other side of it, which seems to me a fitting enough shape for the whole story to take. Nell Caldwell had died 3 years earlier, a little after her 6th birthday, after a long illness that had taken the better part of 2 years to run its course. The kind of illness families do not discuss in detail even among themselves, because the details are not the point and never were. The point was only that a bright, funny, gap-toothed little girl had been loved with everything her mother had, and had died anyway, and her mother had never, in 3 years, found her way fully back up out of that particular grief. Agnes had lived alone since her husband, unable to bear the house full of Nell's absence, had moved out within the year, not from cruelty but from a grief that simply could not share a roof with hers. And she had, by Mrs. Prout's careful account, grown steadily quieter, thinner, more inward over the 3 years since, marking each of Nell's birthdays alone with a cake she did not eat and a hair ribbon she could not bring herself to throw away. That morning had been the anniversary. Mrs. Prout, worried at finding her neighbor sitting alone in the dark with the curtains drawn at 9 in the morning, had gently insisted she come along to the fete instead. Fresh air, a change of scenery, the ordinary well-meaning instinct of a good neighbor who could not have known, and could not have been expected to know, that a lawn full of laughing children on the exact anniversary of her own daughter's birth was very nearly the worst possible place in the kingdom to send a grieving mother that particular day. Agnes had gone along to please her, had wandered the stalls without buying much, had sat on a bench and cried over a ribbon, had told a kind volunteer she was having a hard day and would be all right, and somewhere in the long, golden slide of that afternoon, with children's laughter drifting across the grass all around her, and a 9-year-old girl with dark hair not unlike Nell's own turning her head at exactly the wrong angle in exactly the wrong light, the 3 years of held-together grief had simply, quietly, catastrophically given way. "I don't remember deciding to walk toward her," Agnes told Dr. Halloway that evening, in a statement I was permitted to read weeks later as part of the formal review. "I remember thinking, quite clearly, that Nell had wandered off and I needed to fetch her home before it got dark. I know how that sounds. I have asked myself every hour since how it could possibly be true, and I don't have a better answer than that. For those few minutes, it simply was." Mrs. Aldous, the grief counselor, would later explain it to me in terms I have never forgotten, because they reframed the entire day for me in a way that mattered enormously to how I have carried it since. "Grief of that depth and that duration," she said, "does not always behave like sadness. Sometimes, under enough pressure, an anniversary, a resemblance, an accumulation of sleepless nights, it behaves more like a fracture, a brief and total loss of the boundary between the world as it is and the world a person has spent 3 years unable to stop imagining. It is rare. It is not madness in the way the word gets used carelessly, and it is not, whatever it might have looked like for 11 seconds near a face-painting table, anything resembling the calculated intent of someone who meant a child harm. It is what a mind does sometimes, when it has been asked to carry more than a mind is built to carry, for longer than any mind should have to carry it alone. I think about that explanation often. I think in particular about how close the day had come to being written a different way entirely. A stranger, a snatched child, a villain for the evening papers, when the truth, once you had the whole of it in front of you, asked for something much harder and much more useful than outrage. It asked for care. Not instead of taking the safety breach seriously. We did take it seriously, every hour of that evening and every day of the review that followed, but alongside it, in the same hand, the way King Alaric had asked for from the very first minute. King Alaric's own involvement did not end with his order to Dunmore in the shade of the hedge maze. He visited Agnes Caldwell himself, 3 days later, at the quiet clinic where Mrs. Aldous had arranged for her to begin proper grief counseling, a visit that was never announced, never photographed, and never, as far as I know, mentioned publicly by anyone in the palace press office, because it was not done for anyone's benefit but hers. I was not present for that conversation, and have never asked him what was said. I know only what he told Rowan afterward, relayed to me much later in the ordinary way that things move sideways through a household over time, that he had told her, plainly, that his granddaughter had come to no harm and bore her no anger at all, and that he hoped, sincerely, that she would let the people now around her help her carry what she had been carrying alone for 3 years. The formal process, when it concluded some weeks later, reflected exactly the balance King Alaric had insisted on from the first minute. It did not happen quickly, and it did not happen carelessly. A safety breach involving a member of the royal family is never waved through on sympathy alone, whatever the sympathy warrants, and I gave testimony myself, twice, once to the Town Watch's Review Board and once to the palace's own security inquiry, laying out the 11 seconds in the same plain, exact detail I have given you here. Lang testified. Strayed testified. Dr. Halloway submitted a full medical assessment, and Mrs. Aldous, once engaged, provided a preliminary clinical opinion on the nature of what Agnes had experienced. All of it weighed carefully against the plain fact that a child had been physically taken hold of without consent on palace grounds, which is not a thing any review board, however compassionate, is entitled to simply overlook. What the review found in the end was exactly what those 11 seconds had actually contained. No premeditation, no concealment, no attempt at flight, no history of any kind that suggested a pattern rather than a single, catastrophic break, and a level of immediate, total compliance the moment she was addressed that every witness, guard and bystander alike, described in nearly identical terms. Agnes Caldwell was never charged with any crime. The board's written finding, which I was permitted to read in summary, noted specifically that her conduct met none of the legal thresholds for abduction or assault, and recommended instead a formal welfare referral, which was by that point already well underway. What she received in the end was not a sentence but a structured course of grief support, funded in part, quietly and without her knowledge until much later, by a small trust the palace maintained for exactly this kind of unpublicized kindness. The same trust, I would learn afterward, that had quietly paid for a defibrillator at the town's small clinic 2 winters before, and a widow's heating bill the winter after that. The sort of household generosity that never once required a plaque or a headline to be worth doing. I saw her once more myself, nearly 2 months after the fete, entirely by accident, in the town near the palace gates. She was thinner still than she had been that day, but steadier. I recognized the walk before I recognized the face, the particular unhurried steadiness of someone who has begun, carefully, to trust the ground under her feet again. And she recognized me too, and stopped, and for a moment neither of us quite knew what to say to the other, because there is no small talk built for the two people who once stood on opposite sides of 11 seconds that could have gone very differently. "I wanted to write to the family," she said finally. "I didn't know if that was allowed." "You can write," I told her. "I think they'd want you to. Nobody in that household holds it against you, if that's what you're afraid of." "I hold it against myself," she said quietly, and I did not try to argue her out of that, because grief and guilt are not mine to dismiss on someone else's behalf, and some things a person has to work through in their own time with people better trained for it than a guardsman standing on a street corner. But I told her, because I believed it and still do, that the little girl she had frightened for 11 seconds had asked, within the same minute, whether the lady was going to be all right. Not whether the lady would be punished, not whether she was dangerous, but whether she was going to be all right. And that I thought that question said more true and useful things about forgiveness than anything I could add to it. She did write in the end, a short letter that Alara read to Maelin in the simplified, gentle way a mother chooses when explaining a hard thing to a child who does not need the whole weight of it, only the parts that matter to her. That the lady had been very sad about missing someone she loved very much, that she had made a mistake because of how sad she was, and that she was getting help now and was sorry, truly sorry, for the fright she had caused. Maelin, I am told, considered this with the grave seriousness she brought to most things that summer, and asked her mother to help her write back a short letter of her own, in a 9-year-old's careful hand, that said, among other things, that she hoped the lady felt less sad soon, and that Clover the horse sent his regards. I learned some time afterward what that first night had actually looked like inside the family's own quarters, because Rowan told me himself, months later, in the unguarded way people sometimes tell a guard things they would never say in front of a wider audience, perhaps because a guard has already seen the worst 5 minutes of a day, and there is little point pretending otherwise afterward. Maelin had gone to bed that evening after an unusually long story, unusually many good-night kisses, and one small, specific request, that her father checked twice, not once, that the window latch was properly closed, a request that had nothing to do with anything Agnes Caldwell had actually done and everything to do with the particular, illogical way a child's mind sometimes files a fright under the nearest available worry. Rowan had checked the latch twice, said goodnight a second time, and gone to find Alara sitting alone in the small sitting room they kept for exactly this kind of evening, the fire lit though the season barely called for it, a glass of wine untouched on the table beside her. "I keep seeing her hand around Maelin's wrist," Alara told him, and he told me she had said it flatly, not tearfully, the particular flat voice people use when they are still too close to a fright to have found their way to crying about it properly. "I know she's safe. I checked her twice myself. I still keep seeing it." "So do I," Rowan admitted, and sat with her a long while before either of them said much else, because there is not always a great deal to say to a fright that has already, mercifully, resolved itself. Only the plain animal fact of sitting together afterward, until the body believes what the mind has already been told. It was Alara, in the end, who said the thing Rowan told me had stayed with him longest, turning her wine glass slowly without drinking from it. "She wasn't a monster, Rowan. That's the part I can't get past. If it had been someone who meant harm, I think I could be simply angry and let that be the whole of it. But she wasn't, and I keep thinking about what it must be, to love someone so much that losing them breaks the very thing that tells you what's real. I don't know how to be only frightened of that. I'm frightened of it and I ache for her at the same time, and I don't know what to do with both of those at once." "You don't have to choose," Rowan said. "I don't think Father chose either out there on the lawn. He was furious and he was gentle in the same 5 minutes. I watched him do both." They sat with the fire a while longer, and eventually Alara asked, in the quieter voice reserved for the question underneath the question, whether the guard who had reached Maelin first. She did not yet know my name, only that there had been a guard, fast and sure and impossibly calm, had been thanked properly. Rowan told her he would see to it personally, and did, and it is, I think, the plainest explanation I can give you for why the small ceremony that followed weeks later mattered to me more than I let on to anyone at the time. It was never really about the commendation. It was about a mother and father, sitting up late with a fire they didn't need, wanting to be sure that the person who had made their daughter's worst afternoon last only 11 seconds instead of a lifetime knew that they had noticed, and were grateful, all the way down. I do not know if a stranger's cruelty could have survived contact with that letter. I suspect not. I suspect that is rather the point of raising a child the way this family raises theirs, not sheltered from the world's hard edges entirely, because that is neither possible nor honest, but held closely enough, and taught kindly enough, that when the world's hard edges do reach her, as they did for 11 seconds on a summer lawn, she comes through them still capable of asking whether the person on the other side of the fright is all right too. The Palace Press Office, to its considerable credit, handled the days that followed with the same restraint the family had shown on the lawn itself. A statement went out that evening, brief and carefully worded, confirming only that a member of the public had briefly and unintentionally approached Princess Maelin during the fete, that the princess was safe and unharmed, and that the matter had been resolved by palace security without incident. No name was released. No description beyond a member of the public ever reached print, and when one enterprising reporter from a tabloid weekly managed to piece together enough from a witness's second-hand account to guess at a grieving local woman, the press secretary, a formidable, soft-spoken woman named Mrs. Yarrow, who had handled palace communications for longer than I had been a guardsman, made a personal telephone call to the paper's editor that resulted, remarkably, in the story being spiked entirely. I never learned exactly what was said in that call. I know only that Agnes Caldwell's name never once appeared in print, in any paper, in connection with that day, and that this was not an accident but a decision, made deliberately and held to firmly, by people who understood that protecting a princess's safety and protecting a stranger's dignity were not two different jobs that afternoon, but the same one. Captain Bray, for his part, did what every good captain does after a near miss that ended safely. He took the whole apparatus apart, piece by piece, in the after-action review that followed, looking not for someone to blame but for what the day had actually taught us. What it taught us, in the end, was not a failure of vigilance so much as a gap in how our vigilance was built. That a welfare check, however kindly conducted, needs a clearer line back to the security team when the person being checked on has been circling a member of the family for hours, however innocuous each individual circle looks on its own. Within a month, the palace's protocol for public events carried a new, unglamorous addition. Any welfare contact involving visible distress near a protected family member now triggers an automatic, low-key flag to the ranking security officer on site, not to treat every grieving stranger as a suspect, but simply to make sure that a poppy at a tea tent and a Voss on a lawn are never, again, two separate nets that do not know they are watching the same thread. Fenwick found me that evening, after the lawn had been cleared and the last of the bunting taken down, standing at the guardhouse with 2 mugs of tea he had clearly made as an excuse to say something he hadn't worked out the shape of yet. He handed me one and stood there a moment, working his jaw the way young guardsmen do when they are trying to talk themselves into a sentence. "I froze at the puppet stage," he said finally, "and then a few hours later I was the one who kept the crowd off her while she fell apart, and I keep trying to work out which of those is actually who I am." "Both," I told him, because it was the truest answer I had. Nobody gets to skip the first one. The only thing that separates a guardsman worth having from one who isn't is whether the second one comes. Bray says the same thing you do, word for word near enough. Bray's usually right. It's why he still has the job. He laughed at that more than the joke deserved. the particular loose, grateful laugh of a young man who has spent a whole day being frightened of his own nerve, and has just been told by two people he respects that the fear itself was never the disqualifying part. Lang joined us a few minutes later, and then strayed, and the four of us stood at the guardhouse rail in the cooling evening with our tea going lukewarm, saying very little of substance, which is very often exactly what a team needs after a day like that one. Not analysis, not more debrief, just the plain, unhurried company of people who had stood together at the one moment that mattered and were still standing. I was commended for the intervention, formally, in a small ceremony I found considerably more uncomfortable than any parade I have ever stood through, because I have never found it easy to be thanked for doing precisely the thing I am trained and paid to do. King Alaric said something kind about split-second judgment that I do not fully remember, because I was mostly occupied with not fidgeting in front of the assembled household. But I remember clearly what he said afterward privately, as the small crowd of well-wishers dispersed, and it was just the two of us for a moment near the tea tent where, weeks earlier, a woman had sat crying over a slice of untouched cake. "You could have taken her down hard," he said. "Plenty of men would have, and no one would have blamed them for it, not with my granddaughter's wrist in a stranger's hand. You didn't. She wasn't fighting anyone, sir, just fighting her own grief. Wasn't my place to add to it." He looked at me for a long moment, the way he does when he is deciding whether a man deserves the fuller truth of what he is thinking, and then he said, "That's the whole of the job, isn't it? Not the standing still. Knowing which storms need meeting with a wall and which ones just need a hand held out." I have carried that line with me since, through every ceremonial post and every long, uneventful shift, because I think it is the truest thing anyone has ever said to me about 11 years in a red coat. Most days the job is the wall, immaculate, unmoving, a symbol of a discipline that does not waver no matter what is thrown at it. But every so often, the job asks for the opposite, and the whole art of doing it well is knowing, in the space of 11 seconds, which one the moment in front of you actually needs. Maelin turned 10 the following spring, and Clover the horse, retired fully from public duty by then, living out a comfortable pensioner's life in the palace stables, was walked out especially for the occasion, at her request, so she could feed him a proper carrot in a proper birthday hat, an image that made the whole of the household staff laugh in a way the family badly needed after a difficult summer. She does not, as far as any of us can tell, carry the fate as a wound. She carries it, if she carries it at all, the way children carry most hard things they come through safely. As a story she tells sometimes, matter-of-factly, about the day a very sad lady got her name wrong, and the day she learned that a guard's arm around your shoulders can turn a fright into nothing more than a story before you've even finished being frightened. My sister Wren had her son in the autumn of that same year, a fierce, red-faced boy she named Corin, and I held him for the first time on a Sunday not unlike the one she had promised us news at the summer before, and I found myself doing the arithmetic I always do now, without quite meaning to, counting exits, measuring distances, cataloging every adult in the room the way 11 years of training has taught me to catalog a crowd. Wren caught me at it and laughed, not unkindly, and told me I could put the guard down for one afternoon and just be an uncle. I tried. I am not sure I entirely succeeded, and I am not sure, having lived the day I have told you about, that I want to. Some part of the 7-year-old who lost Wren for 4 minutes at a market 30 years ago is still standing watching me, and I have made a kind of peace with that, because it is the same part of me that closed a hand over a stranger's wrist on a summer lawn and chose, in the space of a breath, to catch a grieving woman's fall as gently as I caught a startled child's, without once mistaking the two for the same kind of danger. That, in the end, is the whole of what I want this story to leave behind. Not that a guard stood between a princess and a threat, though I did, and would again without a moment's hesitation, but that the threat, when it finally came, was not a monster at all. It was a mother who had lost the only thing she had ever truly wanted to keep, reaching, for 11 desperate seconds, toward a resemblance her grief could no longer tell apart from the real thing, and that the measure of a household worth serving is not only how fast its guards can move to protect a child, but how much mercy it still has left over, in the very same breath, for the broken stranger on the other side of that fear. Princess Maelin is safe. She was safe within 11 seconds that day and has been every day since. Agnes Caldwell, last I heard, has begun volunteering one afternoon a week at the very hospital wing whose dedication brought her to that lawn in the first place, reading to children on the ward Dr. Halloway now runs, a slow, deliberate act of turning the worst afternoon of her recent life into something that keeps other families' worst afternoons a little shorter. And I still stand my post most days in a red coat, watching crowds the way I always have, carrying both halves of the lesson King Alaric gave me that afternoon by the tea tent, the wall, and the hand held out, because I have learned, in 11 years and one long summer day, that a guard who only knows how to build the wall has learned only half of what the uniform is actually for.